Imagine this. Your wife invites her ex to dinner at your house and spends the evening laughing at his jokes, reminiscing about their good old days, and then drops the bomb. I don't know why we ever broke up. The audacity, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to Ben. But instead of losing his cool, he did something no one saw coming. He locked her and her ex out of the house, turning the tables in the most jaw-dropping way. But before we dive into this intense story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love gripping tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out. Ben sat at the kitchen table, swirling the coffee in his mug, watching the steam curl upward. Jessica had been distant for weeks, and he couldn't shake the unease coiling in his gut. She wasn't the same woman he'd married 6 years ago. There were the late nights at work she couldn't quite explain, the way she kept her phone glued to her side, screen always turned down. Even her laugh, the one that used to ring so freely in their house, seemed to have vanished. "Everything okay?" Ben had asked one evening as Jessica sat scrolling through her phone on the couch. Her response was quick, curt, almost rehearsed. "Yeah, just busy with work," she muttered without looking up. The excuses piled up like bricks in a wall he couldn't see over. A week ago, he'd caught her standing in the driveway late at night, her voice hushed as she spoke into the phone. When he'd asked who it was, she'd waved him off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a friend from college," she'd said, brushing past him like the conversation wasn't worth his concern. Ben told himself not to jump to conclusions. Jessica wasn't the type to keep secrets. At least, she never had been. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't ignore the growing chasm between them. It was as if she was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how tightly he tried to hold on, she was already gone. Then, over a quiet dinner on a Wednesday night, Jessica dropped a bombshell that made Ben's heart plummet. "Travis is back in town," Jessica said casually, stabbing at her salad with her fork. Ben blinked. "Travis? As in your ex-boyfriend, Travis?" Jessica glanced up, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Yeah, we ran into each other a few weeks ago. I thought it might be nice to catch up." Ben felt his stomach churn. The name Travis wasn't just a name. It was a memory, a shadow from Jessica's past that he'd never wanted to revisit. "Catch up?" he repeated, his voice careful, measured. "Yeah," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I invited him over for dinner this Friday." She met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "It's just dinner." "Just dinner?" The words felt like a blade twisting in his gut. Ben forced a smile he didn't feel, his fingers tightening around the edge of his plate. "Sure," he said finally, though every fiber of his being screamed against it. Jessica tilted her head, studying him. "It's not a big deal, Ben. Don't make it weird." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Of course not." But as she turned her attention back to her food, he couldn't shake the smirk that lingered on her face. It wasn't the kind of smirk that said, "I love you." It was the kind that whispered, "I know exactly what I'm doing." The next 2 days crawled by, each hour more agonizing than the last. Jessica seemed more animated than she had in months, humming as she cooked, texting constantly, her face lighting up in a way Ben hadn't seen in years. On Friday evening, Ben watched her get ready, her reflection glowing in the mirror. She wore a dress he hadn't seen in ages, a deep red number that hugged her curves in all the right places. Her perfume lingered in the air, sharp and intoxicating. She spent almost an hour on her hair, her lips painted a shade of crimson that made her look like someone Ben didn't recognize. "You look nice," he said, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. Jessica glanced at him through the mirror, her smile sharp, her eyes unreadable. "Thanks," she said, turning back to adjust an earring. Ben's unease clawed at his chest as he made his way to the living room. The tension was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As he heard the soft click of Jessica's heels on the hardwood floor behind him, he took a deep breath, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. It was just dinner, he told himself. but in his gut, he knew it was much more than that. As the day of the dinner arrived, the house buzzed with an energy Ben couldn't quite place. Jessica was in full preparation mode, her focus entirely on perfecting every detail. She spent hours cleaning the already spotless kitchen, rearranging the living room furniture, and setting the table with their finest dishes, the ones they hadn't touched since their anniversary years ago. From the couch, Ben watched her flit from room to room, a whirlwind of purpose. She had already been in the bathroom for over an hour, the sound of her hairdryer humming like background static. When she emerged, her transformation was stunning, and yet it struck Ben like a gut punch. She wore a fitted black dress with a plunging neckline, a pair of sleek stilettos, and bold red lipstick. Her hair cascaded in loose waves down her back, and the faint scent of jasmine trailed behind her. Ben's throat tightened. It wasn't the effort that bothered him. It was the fact that it wasn't for him. Jessica hadn't dressed up like this in years. Not for their dates, not even for special occasions. This level of care wasn't meant for her husband. It was meant for someone else. "You're really going all out," he said, trying to keep his tone light, though his voice wavered slightly. Jessica glanced at him, her smile practiced and distant. "It's just dinner," she said with a shrug, brushing past him to grab a bottle of wine from the cabinet. As she moved, the heels of her stilettos clicked against the hardwood floor, each step a reminder of the widening chasm between them. Ben clenched his jaw, the feeling of being sidelined settling deeper into his chest. He forced himself to look away, but the image of her preparation was burned into his mind. The sound of the doorbell broke the tension, sharp and jarring in the otherwise quiet house. Jessica's head snapped up, her face lighting up with an excitement that twisted something inside Ben. She glanced at him briefly, almost as if to gauge his reaction, before striding toward the door with a sway in her step that felt deliberate. When the door swung open, Travis stood on the other side, every bit as smug as Ben had imagined. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a carefully styled head of dark hair. His crisp, tailored blazer and the confident grin on his face screamed success in a way that grated on Ben's nerves. "Jess," Travis exclaimed, pulling her into an all-out familiar hug. His voice was warm, almost theatrical, as if this was a reunion he'd been waiting for his whole life. Jessica laughed, a laugh Ben hadn't heard in months, and leaned into the hug, her hand lingering on Travis's shoulder longer than necessary. "It's so good to see you," she said, her tone light and melodic. Ben stood back, his posture stiff, feeling more like a guest in his own home than the man of the house. He extended a hand as Travis approached, and the handshake was firm, almost challenging. "Ben," Travis said, flashing an overly friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Travis," Ben replied, his tone neutral but strained. "Thanks for having me," Travis said, casually slipping off his jacket and handing it to Jessica, who accepted it with an ease that made Ben's stomach churn. "This place is, cozy," he added, his eyes scanning the living room. The subtle jab wasn't lost on Ben. Jessica laughed, brushing her hair back in a way that felt almost flirtatious. "You should see the backyard. Ben worked so hard on it," she said, her tone dismissive, as if she were humoring a child's hobby. As they moved toward the dining room, Travis's confidence filled the space, his every word and gesture effortlessly commanding attention. Ben followed in silence, his unease growing with every passing second. Travis wasn't just visiting, he was staking his claim, and Jessica seemed all too willing to let him. As they settled at the dining table, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Ben focused on his plate, spearing a piece of roasted chicken as Travis launched into a story about his latest business venture. His voice was rich and animated, punctuated by dramatic hand gestures that seemed designed to captivate. "So there I was, standing in front of this boardroom of investors," Travis began, leaning forward slightly, his grin widening, "and I just knew I had to close the deal right then and there. The pressure was insane, but, well, you know me, I thrive under pressure." Jessica's laugh rang out, high-pitched and enthusiastic. "Of course you do, Travis. You've always been so confident," she said, her eyes sparkling in a way Ben hadn't seen in years. She leaned in closer, her hand brushing Travis's arm lightly. Travis chuckled, clearly enjoying the attention. Well, the deal went through, obviously. Now I'm managing a team of 50 and expanding into new markets. It's exhausting but rewarding. Wow, Jessica breathed, her gaze lingering on Travis. That's incredible. Ben, isn't that incredible? She turned to her husband, her expression expectant, almost daring him to contradict her.
Thank you.
Ben forced a tight smile. Yeah. Sounds impressive, he said, keeping his tone even. He finally sat back and let out a long sigh. The conversation continued, with Travis steering it toward his many accomplishments, traveling to Europe, buying a new luxury car, and his impeccable taste in wine. Jessica hung on his every word, laughing too loudly at his jokes and adding anecdotes from their college days that seemed far too personal for Ben's comfort. The boy, several years younger than Ben, was paying them more attention. Travis, meanwhile, would occasionally glance at Ben, his smile almost challenging, as if to say, "Look what you're up against." Ben gripped his fork a little tighter, forcing himself to chew slowly and remain silent. Ben's emotions churned beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. Each boast from Travis was another crack in his composure. Each laugh from Jessica another twist of the knife. He kept his expression neutral, his responses minimal, but inside, his thoughts were racing. What am I even doing here, he wondered, as Travis regaled them with a story about hiking in the Rockies. Ben noticed how Jessica leaned toward Travis, her posture open and inviting. She hadn't looked at him that way in years. His mind replayed every moment of the past few weeks. Jessica's late nights, the secretive phone calls, the distance that had crept into their marriage. It all led to this, to the smug man sitting across the table and basking in Jessica's admiration. Ben's stomach turned, but he took a sip of wine to steady himself, the bitterness of it grounding him. "I have to say, you've got a nice setup here, Ben," Travis said suddenly, his tone just shy of condescending. "Cozy, like I mentioned earlier. It's refreshing to see someone living simply." Ben's jaw tightened. "I'm happy with what we have," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Jessica laughed, though it felt forced. "Oh, Ben's very practical. He likes to keep things uncomplicated." The subtle jab wasn't lost on him. Ben set his fork down carefully, his knuckles white as he clasped his hands under the table. He glanced at Jessica, who was too busy gazing at Travis to notice. The tension in his chest grew heavier with each passing moment, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't lose his temper, not yet. Instead, he sat back in his chair, masking his frustration with a small, cold smile. "Let them think I'm the quiet one," he thought, for now. As the evening wore on, Jessica's behavior shifted from subtle admiration to outright flirtation. Her laughter grew louder, her gestures more exaggerated, as if she was putting on a performance meant for Travis alone. Ben watched as she reached out, her hand lightly grazing Travis's forearm as she leaned forward. "Do you remember that time we got caught sneaking into the library after hours?" she asked, her voice dripping with nostalgia. Her eyes sparkled as she looked at Travis, completely ignoring Ben's presence. Travis chuckled, clearly enjoying the attention. "How could I forget? We almost got expelled. You were such a bad influence on me," he teased, his grin widening. Jessica playfully swatted his arm. "Me? You were the one with all the crazy ideas," she said, her touch lingering just a second too long. Ben's stomach churned as he watched the interaction. Jessica's body language screamed intimacy. Her knees angled toward Travis, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wineglass as she hung on his every word. It was as though the years they had spent building a life together had vanished, replaced by the shadow of her past. "Those were the days," Jessica sighed wistfully. "Life was so carefree back then. It's funny how things change, isn't it?" Her gaze locked onto Travis, her smile soft and reminiscent. "Ugh." Travis smirked, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, some things change, but some things don't," he said, his tone layered with meaning. Ben's grip on his wineglass tightened, but he said nothing. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as Jessica and Travis continued their verbal dance, each word a dagger to Ben's heart. Inside, Ben's emotions churned like a storm. Every word Jessica spoke, every casual touch she gave Travis, stoked the fire burning in his chest. He sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, and his hands curled into fists beneath the table. What the hell is happening, he thought, his mind racing. He felt like an outsider in his own home, reduced to a silent observer in this twisted reunion. Every laugh Jessica gave Travis felt like a slap, every glance a reminder of how far she had drifted from him. Ben's mind replayed her words from earlier, "It's just dinner." But there was nothing just about it. This wasn't catching up, it was a reunion of old flames, a rekindling of something she had no business entertaining. And the next day at school, she would show up early. He forced himself to remain calm, to breathe deeply and avoid making a scene. But the anger bubbled just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. His nails bit into his palms as he clenched his fists tighter, the pain grounding him in the moment. Jessica's laughter cut through his thoughts, sharp and grating. He glanced up to see her leaning even closer to Travis, her fingers brushing a stray piece of lint from his sleeve. The casual intimacy of the gesture made Ben's blood boil. This isn't right, he thought, the realization settling heavily in his chest. He felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Yet, he said nothing, swallowing his pride and his pain, unwilling to let them see just how much it was tearing him apart. Ben stared down at his plate, his appetite long gone. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Not yet, he told himself, but soon. The conversation took a sudden turn as Jessica, still caught up in the glow of nostalgia, leaned back in her chair and looked at Travis with a wistful smile. "You know," she began, her voice soft yet deliberate, "I don't know why we ever broke up, Travis." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Ben froze, his fork suspended mid-air as he processed what she had just said. His stomach twisted, his chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and rage. Jessica's tone was casual, almost careless, as though she hadn't just shattered the fragile facade of their evening. Travis chuckled awkwardly, glancing at Ben out of the corner of his eye, but he said nothing. The smirk on his face, however, betrayed a sense of satisfaction that made Ben's blood boil. Jessica didn't seem to notice, or care, that her words had struck a nerve. She picked up her wine glass and took a sip, her gaze fixed on Travis, as if Ben weren't even there. Ben's chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as he pushed back from the table, the sound cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. He looked up to stare at the man sitting across from him. "I'm stepping outside," he said, his voice strained and low. His jaw was clenched so tightly it hurt, and his hands trembled as he shoved them into his pockets. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his movements stiff and deliberate. The tension in the room was palpable as Jessica and Travis exchanged uneasy glances. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but the door slammed shut before she could say anything. Outside, the cold night air hit Ben like a slap. He inhaled deeply, the sharp chill stinging his lungs but doing little to calm the storm inside him. His mind raced, replaying Jessica's words over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. He paced the porch, his fists clenching and unclenching as he struggled to contain the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. They all swirled together, leaving him raw and exposed. For a brief moment, he considered walking back inside and confronting them both. But instead, he lit a cigarette he didn't even want, letting the bitter smoke fill his lungs as he stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The cold wrapped around Ben like an unwelcome embrace as he stood on the porch, the sharp night air biting at his skin. The sky above was a deep, endless black, scattered with stars that seemed indifferent to the turmoil unfolding below. His breath hung in the air, curling like smoke before disappearing into the void. He stared out into the empty street, his mind racing. Jessica's words echoed in his head, a cruel refrain he couldn't silence. "I don't know why we ever broke up, Travis." The casual cruelty of it burned, each syllable carving deeper into the fragile foundation of his trust. How did we get here, he thought bitterly, his fingers trembling as he gripped the porch railing. The woman he had married, the partner he had built a life with, was now a stranger sitting across the table, laughing with a man who had no place in their lives. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. The frigid wind whistled through the trees, and Ben couldn't help but draw a parallel to his own state of mind, cold, barren, and stripped bare. He thought about the years they had shared, the sacrifices he had made, and the love he had poured into their relationship. And now, it felt as though all of it had been reduced to ashes. Still, amid the swirling anger and heartbreak, a single thought began to solidify. This isn't just about Travis. Jessica's actions, her calculated touches, her dismissive laughter, it was deliberate. She had let this happen. She had chosen to let it happen. Ben exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air as a grim determination began to take shape. He wouldn't lash out in anger, and he wouldn't crumble under the weight of her betrayal. No, this wasn't the time for emotion. It was the time for action. Flicking his cigarette into the snow, Ben turned toward the house, his jaw set and his eyes cold. If she wants to play games, he thought, then I'll show her just how the game ends. With a calmness that belied the storm within, he stepped back inside, already setting the wheels of his plan in motion. When Ben stepped back inside, the warmth of the house hit him like a wave, but it did nothing to thaw the icy resolve forming in his chest. He closed the door quietly, the soft click almost too loud in the unnerving stillness. Jessica and Travis were in the living room, seated on the couch with a little too much familiarity. Her laughter echoed faintly, but it ceased the moment she caught sight of Ben. "You okay?" she asked, her tone casual but with a hint of curiosity. Ben forced a smile, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he replied evenly, his voice calm but distant. "Needed some air." Jessica gave a brief nod, her focus already shifting back to Travis. Ben's jaw tightened, but he let it slide. He moved to the kitchen, the facade of normalcy hiding the storm inside him. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, as though one wrong move might betray the depth of his anger. From the corner of his eye, he watched Jessica lean closer to Travis, her body language dripping with disregard. Not yet, Ben thought, his hands tightening around the edge of the counter, just a little longer. As the evening dragged on, Ben excused himself again, retreating to the sanctuary of the upstairs hallway. He pulled out his phone, his fingers steady as he searched for a locksmith. The faint murmur of Jessica and Travis's voices drifted upstairs, igniting a fresh wave of resolve within him. When the locksmith answered, Ben's voice was low and firm. "I need the locks changed, tonight." The man hesitated. "Sir, it's late. I'll pay whatever you need. Just get here." He leaned against the wall, his mind racing with the logistics of his plan. The locks would be changed before dawn, and by morning he would have the upper hand. He replayed every insult, every dismissive laugh from Jessica, using it to steel his resolve. The sound of Jessica's laughter floated up the stairs, sharp and grating. Ben smirked to himself, his anger now honed into a weapon. Let them enjoy tonight, he thought. It'll be their last moment of comfort here. With that, he returned downstairs, wearing the same calm mask he'd perfected, his movements slow and deliberate as he rejoined the charade. The house had settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint murmur of voices coming from the guest room. Ben sat at the edge of the staircase, his head tilted just enough to catch snippets of the conversation. The door was cracked open, allowing their words to drift into the stillness of the night. "I mean, he's a good guy," Jessica said, her voice tinged with something that sounded dangerously close to pity. "But sometimes it just feels like we've grown apart, you know?" Travis chuckled softly. "I could have told you that years ago. You're not the kind of woman who's meant to settle for ordinary." Ben's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as the words sank in. He strained to hear more, his breath shallow as Jessica responded. "It's not like that," she said, her voice quieter now, almost wistful. "Ben's steady, reliable, but with you, things were just so exciting. I miss that sometimes." Ben's heart pounded in his chest, each word slicing through him like a blade. He heard the sound of a wineglass clinking against a surface, followed by a low laugh from Travis. "Well," Travis said, his tone smug, "maybe you just need a reminder of what excitement feels like." Jessica laughed softly, the sound cutting through Ben's composure. "Maybe I do." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Ben felt his chest tighten, his pulse racing as their voices continued, growing softer and harder to hear. He didn't need to hear more. The betrayal was crystal clear. In that moment, Ben's anger crystallized into something cold and unshakable. It wasn't a fiery rage anymore. It was a quiet, calculated fury that filled him with an almost eerie calm. This isn't just about him, he thought, his mind sharpening with clarity. It's about her, about who she's chosen to become. Standing, Ben turned and walked back to his room. His resolve was no longer a question. It was a certainty. By morning, everything would change, and Jessica would finally understand the cost of her choices. The soft hum of a van pulling into the driveway broke the stillness of the night. Ben opened the door quietly, stepping out to greet the locksmith, a stocky man with a toolbox slung over one shoulder. "Oh, you called for an emergency job?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Ben nodded, motioning him inside. "Yeah, every lock. Front, back, and the garage. I want them all replaced." The locksmith raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He got to work immediately, his movements efficient and practiced. The sound of tools clicking against metal echoed through the silent house, a sharp contrast to the muffled voices coming from the guest room upstairs. Ben leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as the locksmith removed the old locks, one by one. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like a small victory, a physical manifestation of his decision to reclaim his space and his dignity. The new locks gleamed in the dim light, their sharp edges catching the glow of the nearby lamp. When the locksmith moved to the back door, Ben followed, offering a steadying hand as the man adjusted the latch. The final lock, a deadbolt on the front door, clicked into place with a satisfying thud. "All done," the locksmith said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Here are the new keys." He handed Ben a small bundle, the cold metal heavy in his palm. "Thanks," Ben said, his voice steady. He slid the keys into his pocket and escorted the man back to his van, watching as the vehicle disappeared down the street. Ben stood in the entryway, running his fingers over the new deadbolt. The house was quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. A deep sense of satisfaction settled over him as he locked the door and tested the handle, ensuring it was secure. For the first time in weeks, a small, genuine smile tugged at his lips. This was more than just a set of new locks. It was a boundary, a line he had drawn to reclaim control over his life. He turned off the lights and headed to bed, the keys still clutched tightly in his hand. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The morning light seeped through the blinds as Ben sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. The faint creak of footsteps upstairs signaled that Jessica and Travis were awake. He remained calm, his demeanor cool and composed, the events of the night before hidden beneath a practiced stillness. Jessica was the first to appear, her hair disheveled and her steps casual. She wore one of Ben's oversized shirts, an irony that didn't escape him. She yawned, stretching lazily as she walked into the kitchen. "Morning," she said, her voice light as if nothing was amiss. "Ah!" Ben offered a faint smile. "Morning," he replied evenly, taking another sip of his coffee. Moments later, Travis followed, his presence filling the room with an air of smug nonchalance. His shirt was wrinkled, and he carried himself with an ease that grated on Ben. "Smells good in here," Travis said, his grin too wide as he nodded at Ben. Ben didn't respond, only gesturing toward the coffee pot. Jessica poured herself a cup, leaning against the counter with a contented sigh. The two of them looked far too comfortable, far too unaware of what was about to unfold. She picked up her coffee, gathered her things, and left. Setting his coffee cup down, Ben stood, his movements deliberate and measured. "So," he began, his tone casual, "what's on the agenda for today?" Jessica exchanged a glance with Travis, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We were thinking about grabbing lunch, maybe catching up a bit more," she said, her voice overly casual. Ben nodded thoughtfully, his expression giving nothing away. "That sounds nice," he said, his tone smooth. "You two deserve to enjoy yourselves." Jessica raised an eyebrow, sensing something she couldn't quite place. "You're okay with that?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Of course," Ben said, offering a small, calm smile. "Why wouldn't I be?" The ease in his tone seemed to disarm her, and she nodded slowly. Travis, emboldened by Ben's lack of protest, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Appreciate that, man. Not everyone would be so understanding." Ben's smile didn't waver. "Well, I just want everyone to be happy." Reaching for his keys, Ben walked toward the door, holding it open as Jessica and Travis followed. The moment felt heavy, as if something unspoken lingered in the air. Jessica hesitated, turning to Ben with a puzzled look. "You're coming back, right?" Ben's smile shifted into something colder, sharper. "Nope," he said simply, "but neither are you." With that, he stepped outside, locking the door behind him. The audible click of the new locks was a sound that echoed through the stillness, leaving Jessica and Travis standing on the porch, their confusion giving way to dawning panic. The sharp click of the lock echoed in the still morning air, a sound that cut through Jessica's casual demeanor like a knife. She turned toward the door, confusion knitting her brow. "Ben?" she called, her voice uncertain. She reached for the handle and jiggled it, only to find it unyielding. "Ben, the door's locked." Inside, Ben stood just out of sight, the corner of his mouth lifting into a faint smirk. He didn't respond, letting the silence do the talking. Jessica's confusion quickly gave way to irritation. She pounded on the door, her fist thudding against the wood. "Ben, this isn't funny. Open the door," she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. She glanced back at Travis, who stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, his smug confidence now replaced with growing discomfort. "Is this some kind of joke?" Travis muttered, stepping closer to the door. "Ben, come on, man, let's talk." Jessica's frustration turned to panic as realization began to dawn. Her breaths quickened, and she pounded harder on the door. "Ben, open the door, now!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The cold morning air bit at her skin, and she wrapped her arms around herself, glancing nervously at Travis. Travis shifted awkwardly, his confidence evaporating with each passing second. "I don't think he's joking," he said quietly, his tone uneasy. Inside, Ben remained calm, his movements slow and deliberate as he poured himself another cup of coffee. He leaned against the counter, savoring the warmth of the mug in his hands. Through the window, he watched Jessica and Travis's panic escalate, their frantic movements a sharp contrast to his quiet composure. He didn't need to shout or argue. His silence spoke volumes. For the first time in weeks, Ben felt truly in control, his strength unshaken by their pleas. "Put your weapons down," said Olivia. "He's not going to hurt you." He pushed his weapons over and Olivia placed hers in the window. "Let them face it," he thought, taking a slow sip of coffee. "They deserve this." Jessica's pounding on the door grew louder, her open palms smacking against the wood with frantic urgency. "Ben, this isn't funny," she shouted, her voice sharp and laced with desperation. Her breath came in quick bursts, visible in the crisp morning air. She glanced over her shoulder at Travis, whose discomfort was becoming more apparent by the second. "Do something," she hissed, her tone snapping as she motioned toward the locked door. Travis held up his hands, his expression caught somewhere between exasperation and unease. "What do you want me to do? It's his house." Jessica groaned, turning her attention back to the door. She crouched down, peering through the keyhole as if she might catch a glimpse of Ben inside. "Ben? You can't just lock us out. Let us in!" she screamed, her fists pounding against the door in a wild rhythm. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sign of movement. The silence inside was deafening. "You're being ridiculous," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Open the door or I swear." Her threats hung in the air, unfinished and impotent. The realization that she was utterly powerless began to sink in. Jessica stepped back, her hands trembling. "Ben," she tried again, her tone softer now, almost pleading. "Please, let me explain. It's not what you think." Travis shifted uncomfortably, inching toward the edge of the porch. "Look," he said, his voice low, "I'm not getting involved in this. This is not my problem." Jessica whipped around, glaring at him. "You're just going to leave me here?" she snapped, her voice filled with disbelief. But Travis didn't respond, the unease on his face clear as he avoided her gaze. Inside, Ben sat at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding outside the window. Jessica's frantic movements, her shouting and banging, barely registered to him. He stirred his coffee slowly, the rhythmic clinking of the spoon against the ceramic mug the only sound in the quiet house. His calm demeanor was unshakable, a stark contrast to the chaos on the porch. With every cry and demand from Jessica, he felt a strange sense of vindication. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. For every late-night lie, every whispered phone call, and every touch she had given Travis, this moment felt like balance. Ben leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of coffee, savoring the rich bitterness. Through the window, he caught Travis glancing toward the street, his body language screaming discomfort. A faint smirk tugged at Ben's lips as he watched the cracks in their facade grow wider. He didn't need to say a word. The silence was his weapon, and it was cutting deeper than anything he could have shouted. Jessica and Travis had made their choices, and now they were facing the consequences. The rhythmic pounding on the door faltered as Jessica's frustration gave way to desperation. Inside, Ben stood silently for a moment, listening to her labored breaths before finally stepping closer. He didn't open the door. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm and steady, but laced with a cold edge. "Miss Den?" "Jessica," he began, his tone measured, "do you have any idea how many nights I sat up, wondering where you were? How many times I asked myself what I'd done wrong, and all the while you were out there, laughing with him, whispering into your phone, and making me feel like I was losing my mind?" There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. "At first I blamed myself," he continued, his voice tightening. "I thought maybe I wasn't enough, wasn't exciting enough, wasn't the man you needed. But then I saw it, Jessica. The way you lit up when his name came up, the way you'd turn away from me when you thought I wasn't looking. And last night, you didn't even try to hide it." His words cut through the cold morning air like a knife. "You brought him here, into our home. You laughed at his jokes, reminisced about your good old days, and told him, right in front of me, that you didn't know why you ever broke up. Do you even hear yourself?" Jessica's muffled gasp was barely audible through the door, but Ben pressed on. "You thought I didn't notice, didn't care enough to see it, but I saw it all, Jessica. Every touch, every glance, every word. And last night, while you were whispering to him like I didn't exist, I decided I was done being invisible." He leaned closer to the door, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You made your choices, Jessica. Now you can live with them." On the other side of the door, Jessica's panic was palpable. Her breathing quickened, and her voice cracked as she tried to respond. "Ben, it's not what you think," she stammered, her tone a shaky mix of pleading and defensiveness. I was just, caught up in the moment. It didn't mean anything." Ben didn't reply, and the silence seemed to suffocate her. She stepped closer to the door, pressing her hands against it, Please, Ben, just let me in so we can talk. I swear, I wasn't thinking straight. You have to believe me. Her excuses tumbled out, frantic and disjointed. I've been stressed, and I made a mistake, okay? It was stupid, and I'm sorry. But this isn't fair, Ben. You're overreacting. Jessica's voice wavered, her desperation growing, but from inside there was no response. Only silence, heavy and unyielding, as her panic reached its peak. As Jessica continued her frantic pleas through the door, Travis shifted uncomfortably beside her. His confident demeanor from the night before had completely evaporated, replaced by visible unease. He glanced at the street, then back at Jessica, his expression betraying his desire to be anywhere but there. Decision. This is getting out of hand, Travis muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Jessica turned to him, her eyes wide with panic. What do you mean? You're not leaving, are you? She demanded, her voice laced with desperation. Travis avoided her gaze, his tone defensive. Look, Jess, this isn't my fight. I didn't sign up for whatever this is. He gestured vaguely at the locked door, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I thought we were just catching up, having a good time. I didn't think it was going to turn into this. You can't be serious, Jessica snapped, her voice sharp. You're just going to walk away and leave me here? After everything? Travis raised his hands, stepping back slightly. Hey, I didn't ask to be dragged into your drama. This is between you and Ben. I'm not trying to get involved in whatever mess your marriage is in. Jessica's face twisted in disbelief. You were perfectly fine being involved last night, she shot back, her voice dripping with anger. Now you're just going to run away? Travis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step back, his eyes darting toward his car. I think it's better if I just go, he mumbled, his tone weak and unconvincing. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked down the steps, his movements quick and unsteady. Jessica called after him, her voice a mixture of rage and despair, but Travis didn't look back. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove off without so much as a backward glance. Inside, Ben watched the scene unfold through the window, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Travis's retreat was exactly what he had expected, a man unwilling to take responsibility for the chaos he had helped create, leaving Jessica to face the fallout alone. So, Jessica's voice cracked as Travis's car disappeared down the street. She turned back to the door, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the cold wood. Ben, please, she called, her tone softer now, almost fragile. Let me in so we can talk. I need to explain. The silence from inside the house was deafening, and it only seemed to stoke the growing fire of her desperation. Her pleas quickly turned to frustration. You can't just lock me out, she shouted, her fists pounding on the door again. This is my house too, Ben. You don't have the right to do this. When her anger yielded no response, her tone shifted once more, now thick with tears. I know, I messed up, okay? I wasn't thinking straight. I let things get out of hand. But you have to believe me. It didn't mean anything. I never meant to hurt you. Her sobs punctuated the still morning air, her words tumbling out in a disjointed, frantic rhythm. Ben, you're the one I love. I was just stupid, reckless. But we can fix this. We can fix us. Just let me in, please. She leaned her forehead against the door, her tears streaking her face. When the silence stretched on, she shifted her approach again, her voice dropping to a softer, sultry tone. You remember how good we were, don't you? She whispered. We can have that again. You and me, Ben. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just give me a chance. Inside, Ben stood motionless, listening to every word. Her pleas, her tears, her anger. They washed over him. But they didn't penetrate the wall he had built around his heart. He leaned against the kitchen counter, his coffee mug cooling in his hand, his expression stoic. He didn't need to open the door to see her. He could picture the scene perfectly. The tears streaming down her face, the desperate gestures, the way she switched tactics, trying to find the one that might crack his resolve. But there was nothing left to crack. She had broken it all herself, long before this moment. Jessica's sobs grew louder, but Ben's jaw tightened. He wasn't moved by her tears or her apologies. They felt hollow, like a rehearsed performance, meant to manipulate him into forgetting the betrayal. Her promises to change, to fix things, rang false in his ears. He'd heard enough. Taking a deep breath, Ben finally stepped closer to the door, but he didn't open it. His voice when he spoke was calm and steady. "Jessica, this isn't about fixing things. This is about you showing me who you really are, and I believe you. I believe every word, every action, every choice you've made." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I don't need to argue with you. I don't need to hear your excuses or your promises. This isn't a negotiation. It's over." The weight of his words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Jessica's cries turned into muffled protests, but Ben didn't listen. He walked back to the kitchen, leaving her outside, her voice growing fainter as she realized she had lost. "It's just an experiment," she said, and moved away, keeping her head down. Ben returned to the door one last time, his footsteps deliberate. The sound of Jessica's muffled sobs and frantic pleas filled the air, but he remained unmoved. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting against the cold wood, before speaking. His voice was calm, steady, and resolute. "Jessica," he began, his tone quiet but firm, "this ends here. There's no fixing this. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. Every lie, every touch, every word you shared with him, those were choices. And those choices have consequences." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm done. I've spent too long trying to hold on to something you've already let go of, so this is it. You can take this time to think about what you've done, but you won't do it here. I'll send your things to you, don't come back." His voice carried a finality that left no room for argument. The words echoed in the silence that followed, like the last nail in a coffin. Outside, Jessica froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer weight of Ben's declaration hit her like a blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stared at the door in disbelief, her mind scrambling to process the finality of his words. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't mean that." She reached for the door again, her hands trembling. "Ben, please, don't do this. We can fix it. We can." Her words spilled out in a frantic rush, but they lacked the confidence they had held earlier. The realization that Ben wasn't bluffing began to sink in, and with it, her composure crumbled. She slid down to the porch, her hands clutching her knees as sobs racked her body. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, repeating the same words over and over, as if they might reverse the situation. "This can't be happening. Ben, please. Please don't do this." She lost hope and pulled the trigger. But the door remained closed, a physical and emotional barrier she couldn't break through. For the first time, she was forced to confront the reality she had created, a reality in which her choices had left her utterly alone. As the last echoes of Jessica's voice faded, Ben stood in the quiet house, his hands resting on the kitchen counter. The weight he had carried for weeks, the suspicion, the anger, the heartbreak, seemed to lift, leaving a strange lightness in its place. It wasn't joy exactly, but something closer to relief. He took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs before exhaling slowly. "It's over," he thought, the words settling into him like a mantra. He hadn't realized how much of himself he'd given to trying to salvage something that had been broken for far longer than he cared to admit. Jessica's betrayal hadn't been a sudden thing. It had been a slow unraveling, a series of choices that led them to this moment. Ben's mind drifted to the nights he'd spent waiting for her to come home, the countless times he had questioned himself, wondering if he wasn't enough. He saw now how unfair that had been, not just to him, but to the version of himself that had tried so hard to make their life together work. Jessica's actions weren't a reflection of his failures, but of her choices. Finally, he understood that. He looked around the house, his house, and saw it with fresh eyes. It wasn't the place of conflict and tension it had been for so long. It was his space again, a sanctuary where he could rebuild, not just the walls and rooms, but himself. For the first time in years, Ben felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of possibility that had been buried under years of compromise and silence. The house was quiet now, the kind of silence that felt comforting rather than oppressive. Ben poured himself another cup of coffee, the familiar warmth of the mug grounding him. He sat at the kitchen table, the light filtering softly through the blinds, casting long shadows that stretched across the room. Emily, the stillness was a balm, soothing the frayed edges of his emotions. The distant hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of the wall clock, each sound felt amplified in the absence of chaos. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him like a protective cocoon. Outside, the world continued its slow march forward. Birds chirped faintly, and the occasional rustle of leaves danced in the breeze. But inside, everything felt suspended, peaceful. Ben leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee as he stared out the window, watching the sunlight shift across the lawn. This is what it feels like to let go, he thought, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to look back anymore, only forward. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the sound of freedom. As the hours stretched into the afternoon, Ben found himself thinking about the days ahead, his mind no longer tethered to the past. The realization that he could now shape his own path filled him with a quiet sense of excitement. He had spent so much time trying to hold on to something that wasn't working, but now the future felt open, filled with possibilities. His attention moved once again from the past to the trees standing nearby and the beautiful springtime scene. He reached for a notepad on the kitchen counter, flipping it to a blank page. With a pen in hand, he began to jot down ideas. Simple things at first, fixing the creaky back door, repainting the walls in the living room, reorganizing the garage. But as he wrote, the list grew bolder. Finally signing up for the woodworking class he'd always talked about, planning a solo road trip to the national parks, reconnecting with old friends he hadn't seen in years. Each item on the list felt like a step forward, a way to reclaim his life on his own terms. The sense of control was refreshing, empowering even. Ben knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be moments of doubt, of loneliness, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. As he finished writing, Ben's gaze drifted to the mantel in the living room. Among the neatly arranged decorations stood a framed photo of his family, a snapshot from a happier time. He walked over, picking it up and studying it closely. The image showed him smiling, arms wrapped around people who had always been there for him. He ran his fingers across the frame, a quiet determination settling over him. This is what matters, he thought. The love and support of those who truly cared for him had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. Ben carried the photo to his desk, setting it beside his list of plans. It wasn't just a reminder of the people who had shaped him. It was a symbol of the life he wanted to build. A life filled with authenticity, respect, and genuine connection. As the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the room, Ben smiled to himself. The silence now was no longer an ending, it was a beginning. With the photo standing proudly beside his plans, he felt ready to step into this new chapter of his life.